breaking through the roads of Poland at breakneck speed, putting the great Dominic Toretto to shame, while using his best disguise to avoid any unwanted attention. Napoleon is serving as inspiration for James Bond, aka the least stealthy spy in history.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
So, picture this. Our Corsican friend is not doing illegal street races here in Poland. He has a huge problem on his hands, to put it mildly. He's rushing to Paris after his Russian expedition. What was supposed to be a beautiful summer holiday, full of glory and memories, became a nightmare. Think of it as a team-building exercise where the team mostly dies of dysentery and frostbite. Oopsie daisy. Turns out, invading Russia is bad for your health, and even worse for your horses. But now, the Emperor knows that his enemies won't sit patiently while he licks his wounds. He must rebuild his army soon. Actually, he's already late, because his empire is at risk. Most books and documentaries gloss over this period. It seems like Napoleon lost his army, and a couple of months later, in Germany, new forces magically appeared out of thin air. So, Emperor Napoleon, you have a lifeline here. Which option are you going to choose? Let's be honest, nobody is going to be entertained by logistics and technical stuff. We have more exciting things in our lives right now. The public wants big battles, risky flanking maneuvers, and that's what they get. However, here on this channel, we are not the regular crowd. We are intellectuals, some more than others though, and we need to know, how did Napoleon rebuild his army after the Russian blunder? We are going to focus on the cavalry because that branch took the biggest hit in the Russian expedition. It went from huge hordes shaking the earth to a very small pack of anorexic horses, only strong enough to provide a small escort to the emperor during the retreat. I cannot move forward without explaining what cavalry does on a Napoleonic battlefield. I mean, it's not my choice. It's the rules of writing. I can't introduce something without explaining it. I promise this part will be brief, quick, and to the point. Because you deserve the best quality, my friends. As the protagonist said, cavalry is important before, during, and after the battle. Hopefully, everyone understood what I'm trying to say in this beautiful quote. But for those who weren't paying attention, cavalry played a crucial role in every aspect of a military campaign, not just in big battles. It was divided into two main categories. First, the light cavalry, composed of hussars and chasseurs. These guys wore flamboyant outfits and were known for being womanizers, which is really not a good thing for PR purposes, but somehow people find them fascinating. They did the dirty work of the French army, scouting, fighting for information, skirmishing, and pursuing the enemy after it was defeated in the main battle. Then we have the direct descendants of medieval knights, wearing shiny armor on massive horses. I'm talking about the heavy cavalry, dragoons and cuirassiers. They were usually held in reserve, saved for the big push, the final blow. Basically, they were the LeBron James of their time, saving their energy for the big showdown. There was a type of cavalryman for every situation. There are more categories, but getting into too many specific names or types would overload our memories, and we need to be precise on this channel, we have limited bandwidth. Who hasn't heard about the great cavalry charge at Eylau, where the flamboyant Murat, mounted on a giant horse and wearing, let's say, a very particular minimalistic outfit, led a horde of French cavalry against the Russian centre? Who hasn't heard of the deeds of the great Hussar Lassalle, or our dear general and future marshal, Grouchy? We might take for granted the quality of the French cavalry when hearing about these past victories and successes, but there is a deeper truth behind everything. I'm opening Pandora's box here, and I'm not afraid of taking the heat. For European contemporaries, it was known that French cavalrymen weren't actually that great. Now, I'm not taking any merit away from the achievements I mentioned before. However, I respect my audience, and I need to be precise and truthful. I'm not running a French propaganda channel, and probably never will. Well, if the paycheck is good, I might.
Okay.
The real strength of the French cavalry wasn't that it was led by Murat or Lassalle. It could have been led by me, and I'm a little overweight, and the results wouldn't have been much different. The real power came from its ability to work as a group. The French managed to concentrate their cavalry and maneuver it as a bloc. The Austrians or Prussians might have been better trained and equipped individually, but the French had an edge when fighting as a unit. To put it simply, the French had the power of friendship on their side when it came to cavalry. So, what gave the French a disadvantage in cavalry? Well, let me introduce you to a little period called the French Revolution. Chopping heads, persecuting the church, and chasing down nobles in the streets doesn't come without a price. It might sound nice nowadays to do that with our oligarchs and some politicians, but the French paid a huge price in terms of military leadership. I hate to break it to you, but nobles during that period didn't just sit at home waiting for the worst to happen. They fled to other countries, causing a massive brain drain. The cavalry branch took the biggest toll due to the revolution. Back then, being a mounted troop was a sign of prestige. All the rich nobles and trust fund kids wanted to be horse riders, leading charges and taking all the glory like medieval knights. Promotions also favoured noblemen, so most cavalry commanders came from high-class backgrounds. When they left, the cavalry was basically a car without wheels. They managed to overcome these difficulties through sheer numbers and patriotism, but this lack of leadership became a huge headache for future French leaders.
Oh, God! Oh, God!
So, jumping back in, we have Napoleon in his carriage, probably nursing the mother of all headaches. And who can blame him? He doesn't have an army, and he needs to get back to Germany by spring. The Emperor is experiencing a level of stress that would break most people. I mean, imagine dealing with that today. We've got opioids, tobacco, mushrooms, whatever your poison is. But Napoleon? He had nothing, aside from an army of personal servants and a few mistresses to let some steam off. But hey, silver lining, this isn't his first rodeo. The French have been patching up obliterated armies since the Revolution. So Napoleon is about to borrow some of those tried and true tactics, including a few he's used in his own recent campaigns. I like to call this particular strategy opening the gates. Now, to be clear, this is less of a solution and more of a haphazard bandage slapped onto a gaping wound.
To say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
But when all of Europe is out for your blood, you don't exactly get to be picky. To put it bluntly, if you could sort of ride a horse, you were in. Actually, scratch that. You didn't even have to prove you could ride. If a recruiter looked at you and thought, "Yeah, I can work with that. Congratulations!" You were now cavalry material. This was basically the 19th century equivalent of modern military recruiters haunting underfunded high schools, persuading kids to join the army or the Marines. No excuse was too big. No problem was disqualifying. If you were a poor Louis with 2 legs and at least 1 good eye, congratulations. Welcome to the armed forces. And cavalry? No exception. So how did this chaotic recruitment process actually work? Well, ideally, the new recruits had some experience with horses. Keyword, ideally. They were gathered in specific locations where cavalry regiments were stationed. In the 1813 campaign, for example, the city of Metz became a massive staging ground for training these would-be horsemen. Now, on the surface, this doesn't sound too crazy. After all, cavalrymen have to start somewhere, right? And sure, that's a fair concern. But here's the catch. Cavalry isn't infantry. You can't just slap a uniform on someone, hand them a musket, and call it a day. Training a skilled horseman takes years. And with these desperate measures, they were skipping that entire process. We'll dig into why that's a problem later, but for now, just know this was about to get messy. The problem of inexperience. Oh, yeah. Everyone knew that was an issue. But Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, figured the solution was almost insultingly simple. Just shove some NCOs from other units into these new formations. Preferably ones with at least a little battle experience. Or at the very least, slightly more than the fresh recruits. Not much though. So, what do we have here? A delightful mix of young, eager springlings and furious, charismatic officers trying to hold it all together. Now, let's get one thing straight. An NCO, or officer. That's the true backbone of an army. Sure, history loves to put the spotlight on the brilliant generals. The ones huddled over massive maps, pushing little wooden blocks around like they're playing the world's most high-stakes board game. They get all the credit for battlefield genius. But the soul of an army? That's the guys leading squadrons, platoons, and companies. The ones actually making sure people do more than just exist on the battlefield. They're the real MVPs. And while we're busting myths, let's talk about those classic war movie moments. You know the ones, soldiers charging fearlessly into battle, with a knife stuck in their mouth as they run headfirst into gunfire like they're powered by pure nationalistic adrenaline. Yeah, that's not how things work in real life. Human beings aren't bulletproof, and they know it. Soldiers don't want to run into a hail of gunfire. That's not cowardice, that's basic survival instinct. The average soldier, when faced with near certain death, will hunker down. Because guess what? No one wants to die. Especially in an era where battles were fought standing in neat little lines, staring directly at the people who were about to shoot at them. Even in World War II, most soldiers were highly risk-aware, diving for cover the second they heard incoming fire. Entire units would freeze up under the sustained fire of a single enemy machine gun. Now, if this sounds like I'm being a little judgmental, like I'm calling soldiers cowards, trust me, I'm not. I just want to paint a realistic picture. Rambo? Chuck Norris? Fun to watch, sure, but a real soldier values his life. Of course, what do I know? I've never been in battle. The closest I got was when my mother came after me with a belt for breaking her favourite wine glass. Hey, I survived. So take my words with at least some validity. But in actual battlefield situations, when entire units were pinned down, too terrified to move forward, that's when the NCOs and experienced officers earned their paychecks. They led by example. They inspired their men to push forward, whether through motivation, sheer force of will, or, I don't know, threats of no dessert after the battle. Maybe they promised that anyone who didn't advance would be stuck cleaning latrines for the rest of the campaign. Whatever worked. Now, this kind of leadership was critical in 1813 because, fun fact, Napoleon was running out of officers. Constant warfare had chewed through his pool of experienced veterans, leaving him with a serious leadership shortage. So, where did he get his new NCOS to lead the recruits? Simple. He gutted the French army in Spain. Veteran soldiers from the Peninsular War were pulled from their units, reassigned and shipped off to Germany. Some of them even got promoted on the way, because, well, desperate times call for desperate measures. These seasoned warriors and the survivors from Russia formed the backbone of the officer corps for Napoleon's 1813 campaign. Was it ideal? Number. Was it necessary? Absolutely. But this solution doesn't seem completely out of left field, and you'd be absolutely right to think that. I mean, we're talking about Napoleon here. We expect some stroke of genius, some brilliant hidden solution that no one else saw coming. And lucky for you, I'm here to deliver exactly that. Let me introduce you to the Gardes d'Honneur. Nobody saw the creation of a brand new cavalry unit coming. I mean, given the dire situation, you wouldn't think that would be a good idea. But Napoleon? He anticipated the obvious problems and worked around them before anyone could say, wait, maybe this is a bad idea.
Oh God, please, no! 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 No!
Now, any armchair general could tell you that forming a brand new cavalry unit under these circumstances sounds like a nightmare. No time for training, no experienced riders. Total disaster waiting to happen. And I hate to break it to you, but if you thought of this issue, do you really think Napoleon hadn't already figured that out? Come on now. So, what's our little Corsican's master stroke? Simple. Recruit horse riders from the noble class. On paper, this actually sounds like a decent plan. You're picking people who already know how to ride a horse, which, let's be honest, is kind of an essential skill for cavalry. They're probably literate, which means instead of assigning them personal trainers, you can just print out a few manuals and tell them, here, read this. Efficiency at its finest. And aside from being able to read, they likely have more education and experience than your average peasant recruit fresh from the countryside. So, in theory, their training won't take too long. Now, sprinkle in a few seasoned veterans from other units to whip them into shape. And voila, problem solved. You've got yourself a brand new cavalry unit ready to charge straight into history. Napoleon wasn't just a commander, an emperor, a womanizer, and a below-average novelist. Oh no, he was also something of a financier. And before you roll your eyes, hear me out. This isn't exactly an outlandish statement, especially considering that the last of Napoleon's descendants is, wait for it, a hedge fund manager, or something like that. So financial acumen clearly runs in the family. Now, let's talk about one of Napoleon's more creative cost-cutting measures. By recruiting nobles into his army, he basically pulled a brilliant move. Look, I'm letting you be part of my glorious army. So why don't you go ahead and buy your own clothing and weapons? Oh, and guess what? I'll even throw in a combo deal. Get the pre-sale package now and you might just score a discount on a sword. Yes, the gardes d'honneur weren't just cavalrymen. They were also self-sufficient in a way that must have made Napoleon's bookkeepers very happy. Unlike the regular army, where the state had to foot the bill for uniforms and equipment, these noble recruits were expected to pay for their own gear. And what did they get in return? The privilege of wearing a very fancy hussar-style uniform. Now, I know people at the time loved hussar uniforms, but personally, not a fan. It just screams Eastern European to me. This isn't a fashion channel, so let's move on. But here's where Napoleon the politician makes an appearance. By recruiting young nobles, he wasn't just filling his cavalry ranks. He was making sure these aristocratic families had a stake in his empire. Because once their sons were riding into battle under Napoleon's banner, their loyalty was suddenly a whole lot more personal. In other words, this wasn't just recruitment, it was blackmail with extra steps. The aristocracy had no choice but to root for Napoleon's success because, well, their kids were literally in the line of fire. If Napoleon lost, their sons might not be coming home. So, in one swift move, Napoleon got himself a new cavalry unit, saved a fortune on military expenses, and kept the nobility invested in his regime. If that's not next-level political maneuvering, I don't know what is. For Germany, Napoleon left his army under the command of his brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, and with unwavering, undying loyalty. Murat promptly escaped, handing over command to Eugène. Basically, Murat took one look at the flaming disaster that was the French army and thought, you know what? This is someone else's problem now. People love to talk about Bernadotte being a traitor, but what about this guy? Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked, but I had to get that out, or it was going to ruin my night. Now, Eugène, unlike Murat, at least stuck around. He didn't follow Napoleon's advice to extend his ground beyond the Elbe River. But in Napoleon's defense, he was always bad at micromanaging and didn't have an exact picture of how utterly wrecked the French army was. So Eugène had no choice but to retreat way behind the defensive lines Napoleon had wanted to hold. But whatever, technical stuff. Not entirely relevant to our main topic. But hey, it never hurts to know a little extra history. Murat even wrote Napoleon a beautiful, heartfelt letter before his betrayal was fully complete after Leipzig.
Oh my God! Wow!
Some people might even shed a tear reading it. But betrayal is betrayal. Disgusting, ugly betrayal. Alright, let's switch gears. Imagine this. You're a young noble, the descendant of a somewhat prominent bourgeois family. Your father is an artisan, but, manual labour? not for you. So you decide, you know what? The army sounds like a great way to gain reputation, glory, and most importantly, a fantastic uniform. Congratulations! You've joined the Garde d'Honneur. And after a grueling 4 weeks of training, most of which was actually done on the march to the staging grounds in Germany, you're finally ready. And by training, I mean something very casual. You'd march 20 miles a day. And by the time you arrived at camp, you and your unit would squeeze in a little training. Nothing too intense, though. Because, well, you had another 20 miles to walk the next day. But wait a minute. Something feels off.
I love women. I can't help it.
You glance around at your fellow cavalrymen and realize that some of them don't have horses. And that's kind of a big deal. Because, you know, you're in the cavalry. And now you're on to something. We've been talking about recruitment, training, sabers, uniforms, and all that fun stuff. But where are the horses coming from? And that, my friends, was one of the biggest logistical nightmares of the 1813 campaign. See, France didn't exactly have unlimited horses lying around. It took at least 4 years to properly raise one for military service. And to make matters worse, there were all these ridiculous regulations about what kind of horse could be assigned to which unit. Dragoons and cuirassiers needed big horses. Hussars? They preferred smaller, lighter-coloured horses. Everyone was picky. And the problem was that there simply weren't enough horses to go around. So what did Napoleon do? He panicked. Standards were lowered. Horses were imported from Germany and from across the Normandy region of France. But there was a bigger issue. Key horse breeding areas in Germany had fallen into enemy hands. And that was a serious problem. Why? Because those regions produced the best horses, the BMWs and Mercedes of their time. The ones everyone wanted, the kind you'd proudly show off. By contrast, the French horses from Normandy, they were the old Renaults of the cavalry world, the kind of mount you wouldn't give 2 thoughts about unless you had no other choice. This loss didn't just hurt prestige, it directly impacted the quality of the French cavalry. Then, just when you think it can't get any worse, you start counting heads. And now you're really sweating. Because for the entire German campaign, Napoleon has maybe 15,000 to 20,000 cavalrymen. Meanwhile, the opposition, they've got at least 70,000. So, not only is the quality of your forces questionable at best, but the numbers are downright terrifying.
What's this? Huh? What's this?
And at this point, you might start wondering if you made the right career choice. But here's the thing about the French army. Despite the catastrophic issues with logistics, numbers, and training, morale remained sky high. Why? Because at the end of the day, they were led by the great Napoleon himself. And that was enough to convince everyone that somehow everything would be fine. So here you are, rocking a slick hussar uniform, standing in Germany, waiting for the Emperor to arrive at the staging area. Spirits are high. Napoleon is here. The Empire will be saved. Then you get your first mission, reconnaissance in strength. Simple enough, right? Well, no, because there's a small, tiny problem. You have no idea what you're doing. Your basic training lasted a whole 3 weeks. Barely enough time to mount a horse without immediately falling off. There aren't enough men to make a difference in any meaningful operation. And worst of all, you completely skipped battalion-level training, which is kind of a big deal when it comes to maneuvering and understanding how entire units function. In short, you don't even know how to do your job. The generals are not thrilled about this revelation. They argue against using the new units for serious scouting or skirmishing. But what choice do they have? There's no one else. So, their brilliant solution: on-the-job training. And who better to teach you than Marshal Bessieres himself? This is the equivalent of a 3-week guitar player who bought a $100 classical guitar off Facebook Marketplace, suddenly getting Jimi Hendrix or Keith Richards as a personal tutor. Pretty exciting, right? So, with Bessieres leading the way, you set off on your first mission. A relaxed little ride through the German countryside, scouting for enemy movement. It almost feels like a picnic. And then, boom! A massive cannonball ricochets off a tree, cuts Marshal Bessieres in half, and just like that, your legendary mentor is gone. Rest in peace, Marshal Bessieres. Turns out, being motivated by a famous commander isn't much help when they get instantly obliterated by artillery. Welcome to war. So, the next morning, you wake up a little shaken. Your first day wasn't exactly a triumph. Sure, you spent some quality time with your horse and did a bit of sightseeing around the German countryside. But the whole skirmishing thing? Yeah, not great. You got outmaneuvered by enemy light cavalry, hesitated to take risks, and struggled to coordinate with your fellow recruits. Oh, and let's not forget, you also managed to lose a Marshal of France in battle, or at least half of him. Not exactly the glorious start that you envisioned. Napoleon, seeing that the Gardes d'honneur were not working as intended, had one last trick up his sleeve: an intense apprenticeship program. His solution: he split the Gardes d'honneur into small groups and assigned them to the Old Guard, where they could learn firsthand from actual experienced cavalry. A little on-the-job training, except the job involved charging into musket fire. Basically, he turned them into interns, except instead of fetching coffee, they were expected to watch and learn how to survive on a battlefield. Meanwhile, other, less fortunate units didn't get this luxury. They were simply thrown straight into the front lines because the army needed numbers, and there was no time to fix their inexperience. But as for the Gardes d'honneur, they spent the rest of the war shadowing the pros. The rest of the units did all right during the German campaign, at least before the armistice of Pleaswitz. The officers and generals stepped up, taking responsibility for the situation and leading from the front, using sheer bravery to help bridge the gap in experience. After the utter catastrophe at Leipzig, all the problems we had discussed earlier didn't just linger. They threw themselves a party and invited even more issues. 3 entire cavalry units were wiped out. The infantry was left in tatters, and we had no choice but to patch things up with whatever troops were still standing and bring in fresh recruits.
Stop it. Get some help.
The lack of numbers and proper training was glaring. Think of it like trying to win a chess match with half your pieces missing and the rest barely knowing the rules. But hey, silver lining alert! It turned out to be a great first chance for the Gardes d'honneur to prove themselves during the 1814 campaign, and they did manage to pull off some commendable moves that earned their minute small place in history. This period of reconstruction after the Russian blunder was like trying to put a band-aid on a missing limb. The French army was bleeding out, and while Napoleon worked his usual magic, lowering standards, stealing horses, and micromanaging uniform colours like a stressed-out fashion designer, he couldn't conjure up manpower and resources out of thin air. Now, Napoleon had pulled off miracle rebuilds before. After the 1807 Polish campaign, his army was basically a collection of exhausted, half-starved guys in ripped uniforms, but somehow, by 1809, they were back in shape and ready to fight Austria. But by then, things were already starting to slide. Units were getting sloppier, battalion manoeuvres looked more like improv dance routines, and overall, things were less grande armée and more, guys, please keep it together. The cavalry problem? Napoleon had cheated his way out of that one before. After 1807, he borrowed, permanently, most of Austria and Prussia's cavalry. But by 1813, that trick wasn't going to work. There were no horses left to steal. Normandy's horses were slow and unimpressive, while Germany, the good breeding ground, was now enemy territory. It was like losing your dealership for Ferraris and being left with a bunch of old Renaults. At this point, Napoleon was running on fumes, but he kept going. The modern view of the French army in 1813 is that they were just a bunch of guys waiting to surrender. But let's not forget, for 2 decades, these lunatics had given everything. France basically threw an entire generation into the meat grinder, and somehow they still kept showing up for work. Even after Russia, even with his army in shambles, Napoleon was still in the fight. The man had one arm tied behind his back, 4 guys trying to punch him at once, and somehow he was still landing blows. Would I have thrown in the towel? Yes, immediately. But Napoleon? Absolutely not. Maybe that's why, after abdication in 1814, he tried to poison himself, because he simply could not compute the idea of losing. Maybe it was pride, insanity, or just the world's most dramatic mic drop. Who knew horse shortages could lead to such deep thoughts?